Welcome. Hello. I'm Ellen Lupton. Can you hear me? I'm Senior Curator of Contemporary Design here at Cooper Hewitt, and it's my delight to welcome you to tonight's celebration. We have been open now for 6 weeks after closing for 3 years for our renovation. And tonight's event focuses on our newly restored Jewel in the Crown, the former Andrew Carnegie Family Library, informally known here by our family as the Teak Room. No part of the museum's renovation received more tender loving care than Lockwood de Forest's amazing Teak Room. And you can see here conservators cleaning and preserving that room. We could not be more thrilled with the outcome, and what better way to highlight this special asset, the only extant Lockwood de Forest interior in the original setting for which it was designed, than to organize an exhibition that pays homage to its designer, to his influence, and to his mentor, the Hudson River School painter, Frederic Church. Topics covered in tonight's program include de Forest's clients and earlier commissions, his relationship with Frederic Church, his intrigue with India, and sources for the Teak Room commission. Cooper Hewitt is indebted to the American Express Foundation and the American Express Historic Preservation Fund for their tremendous generosity in providing support for the restoration of the Teak Room and for our exhibition. We're very grateful to the Olana Partnership for their collaboration in tonight's event and for their generous loans to the exhibition. And we urge you to go to Olana and see the beautiful work there. We would also like to thank Mr. and Mrs. Frank Goss of Sullivan, Goss and American Gallery for their support of this evening's reception, viewing, and object donations. Regrettably, they cannot be with us tonight, but they are represented by Jeremy Tesmer, Gallery Director. And of course, thanks to our other lenders, Posey Bass and Henry Taves, the Metropolitan, Cleveland, and Indianapolis Museums of Art, the Field Museum, Molly and Joe Seiler, David Scott Parker, Bryn Mawr College, and Smithsonian Libraries. I do think that your loans look better here than ever, anywhere, of course. So tonight we're going to have 3 presentations, followed by a Q&A with the audience, and I'm going to briefly introduce our outstanding scholars who will be presenting, and then they'll come up one by one and speak to you. Our first speaker will be Gail S. Davidson, Curator of Drawings, Prints, and Graphic Design at Cooper Hewitt, and she is the co-curator with Sarah Coffin of our exhibition called Passion for the Exotic, Lockwood de Forest, Frederic Church. She received her PhD from Harvard University in 1980, and as a graduate student, Gail co-curated the first exhibition ever on American Luminism at Harvard's Fogg Art Museum. At Cooper Hewitt, she has curated 6 exhibitions, including the critically acclaimed Frederic Church, Winslow Homer, and Thomas Moran, Tourism in the American Landscape, an exhibition based on Cooper Hewitt's collection of over 2,000 drawings and oil sketches by Frederic Church, and over 200 drawings by Winslow Homer, a collection that Gail oversees. Outstanding. Tonight, her talk will be on Lockwood de Forest, Painter as Diarist. Our second presentation will be by Roberta A. Mayer, Professor of Art History at Bucks County Community College in Newtown, Pennsylvania. She is author of Lockwood de Forest, Furnishing the Gilded Age with a Passion for India, and Stella Elkins Tyler, A Legacy Born of Bronze. Her articles have appeared in numerous journals, including Winterthur Portfolio, Studies in the Decorative Arts, and Archives of American Art Journal. She has also received many awards, including the prestigious Robert C. Smith Award for the Decorative Arts Society in 2001. Recently, she was guest curator for All the Raj, Frederic Church in Lockwood de Forest, painting, decorating, and collecting at Olana, an exhibition held at the Evelyn and Maurice Sharp Gallery at Olana State Historic Site in Hudson, New York. And our last speaker will be Sarah Coffin. Since joining Cooper Hewitt as head of the Product Design and Decorative Arts Department here at Cooper Hewitt 11 years ago, Sarah Coffin has curated and co-curated 5 exhibitions with publications, the last of which was Set in Style, The Jewelry of Van Cleef and Arpels. For the museum's reopening, she was the project manager for the Permanent Collections Galleries exhibition on the 2nd floor and was co-curator with Gail Davidson of Passion for the Exotic, Lockwood de Forest, Frederic Church. Sarah's research in late 19th century aestheticism began with her Yale thesis on the furniture and interiors of architect Henry Hobson Richardson. To India, partially funded by a Smithsonian research grant 3 years ago, expanded her research to better understand the context of de Forest designs and commission. So I welcome you to be enlightened by this amazing suite of presentations. Good night.
Thank you, Ellen. Before I begin, and because I don't give individual credits on the images, I would like to thank Olana State Historical Site, the Heckscher Museum, Huntington, New York, Posey, Bass, and Henry Taves, de Forest's East Coast descendants and major de Forest champions, David Scott Parker of Associated Artists, Sullivan Goss, an American Gallery, Gerald Peters, Deborah Force, Gerald Wunderlich and Company, and finally Mark Murray for the images they provided. And a special thanks to Amanda Kesner, who up till the last minute was fiddling with my PowerPoint because 3 people were working on it at once. So you will see the results, hopefully acceptable. While recent scholarship has initiated by Roberta Mayer's research on Lockwood de Forest and book has focused on Lockwood de Forest's career as an interior designer. Oh, I forgot to say, I am going to try to hurry through slides because there literally is a lot of ground to cover. There has been relatively little written on, especially in the East Coast, to present de Forest's present oeuvre. Perhaps this talk will start a trend. De Forest, who you see here in 2 images reflecting 2 aspects of his creative activities, the painter and the passionate love of the exotic. Painting was a very personal experience. It was his way of expressing his emotions through color and light. Though he created some large exhibition pictures, basically he painted small oil sketches for his own pleasure and to document his life experiences. From the start of his career under Frederic Church, he signed his sketches as did Church, with his initials, date, and frequently the location. His paintings then become a visual diary of his life, supplemented by letters which he wrote mostly to family and his close colleague and friend, Walter Lant Palmer. I'm going to give you just a tiny bit of biographical background for those who are new to de Forest. De Forest was born into a well-to-do and socially connected New York family. His father, Henry Grant de Forest, and his two brothers, Robert and Henry Wheeler de Forest, were Yale graduates and lawyers in the family firm of Weeks and de Forest. Lockwood also had a sister, as well as an orphaned cousin, Harriet Carnes, living with them. Hattie, as she was called, was the niece of Frederic Church's wife, making Lockwood the great-nephew of Church by marriage. Both Church and the de Forest families socialized and traveled together. They traveled independently to Europe in 1868-69 and met in Rome in December 1868. Church, who had just returned from a trip to Egypt and the Middle East, showed Lockwood around the antique shops in Rome and also had Lockwood and his family visit his studio there. Clearly, de Forest was an the artist's worldliness and painting skills. When Church invited him to experience a painter's average workday by tagging along on a trip to Athens, the young 18-year-old de Forest jumped at the opportunity. Church had been planning to sketch after the Parthenon and surrounding remains in preparation for a major painting of the Greek temple, which some of you know is now at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. He had de Forest set up his easel right next to his own. They could have been using traveling paint boxes as well. De Forest observed his mentor selecting the best angle to show of the building, judging how close to get, studying the light at different times of day. Some of you saw this pairing upstairs. Here we see the young de Forest working on the placement of the drum fragments in relationship to each other. He's not yet learned, de Forest on the left, Church on the right. He's not yet learned how to convey depth, light, color, or texture, which he would develop soon. Yet he had a natural talent, and this is a pretty good start for someone with no real training except for some brief lessons in Rome with a Swiss-German painter named Hermann Corrodi. When the de Forest family, returned to New York, Lockwood asked his parents' permission to forego college at Yale to become a painter. He studied for a short while with James Hart, a respected second-generation Hudson River School landscape painter, but anxious to get his career going, he decided to ask his great-uncle, Frederic Church, if he would take him on as a student, which Church rarely did. This choice gave Lockwood the benefit of Church's professional as well as his professional connections. De Forest arrived at Church's studio outside Hudson, New York, in January 1871. Church had him begin by copying his Middle Eastern 1868 oil sketches, but de Forest also must have studied Church's entire collection of oil sketches, including those of Niagara, which he had painted some years before. And here you see Church Lockwood de Forest on the left. So you can judge for yourself. With the memory of Church's oil sketch of the Niagara Rapids in his head, Lockwood diligently attempted to convey the vigorously churning whitewater rapids against the dark green forest, which found so easy to replicate. You can see some of Church's brushwork on the right, where he literally his brush scribbles over the surface of the water to give the effect of movement. Sorry, lost my place. A revealing measure of de Forest's progress is the comparison of their late winter 1871 or 1872 paintings of the winter sunset looking southwest from Olana, with the snow-covered slopes of the hill in the foreground, the Hudson Valley in the left distance, and the distant Catskill Mountains in the center and to the right. The setting sun over the Catskills reflects on the undersides of the high layers of clouds in hues of orange and white. In this exercise, de Forest is developing skills. And by the way, I'm trying to show you the scale of de Forest's sketch in comparison to Church's larger sketch. In this exercise, de Forest is developing his color skills and his brush handling, which became lighter and more nuanced. Capturing sunsets, one of Frederic Church's greatest achievements, stayed with de Forest for the rest of his life. By 1872, de Forest was confident enough with his painting skills that he decided to use his family connections and his artistic friendships to rent a studio in the 10th Street Studio Building, where he was in the company of Sanford Gifford, Frederic Church, Jervis McEntee, who were also tenants. Also in 1872, de Forest produced his first large-scale exhibition paintings, which were shown at the National Academy. While he exhibited at the Academy and elsewhere, de Forest never studied formally, never studied painting at the Academy or elsewhere. He devised his own personal trajectory of study based on intermittent lessons with Church and painting at all the places that Church and other Hudson River Valley landscape painters painted. For example, he sketched in the Adirondacks as well as Maine, and these two sketches of the Adirondack lake shores show him trying to balance foreground detail with background looser brushwork. The mid-1870s marked a second stage in de Forest's development as a painter when he found an entirely new, exotic landscape and culture that would determine the future of his professional life. The 25-year-old de Forest traveled with his family on an extended tour of Egypt and the Middle East. His goal was to see as many of the places that Church had seen almost 10 years earlier: Egypt, Palestine, and what is now Syria and Lebanon. For some reason that I don't know, he never went to Petra. Maybe some of you have that answer. Stopping in London and Paris, as well as Italy, the de Forest arrived in Cairo in mid-December 1875. Egypt was a dream come true. The scenery entranced him. Everything you see is a perfect picture. You can't even look out of your window without seeing 4 or 5 things that you want to make studies of. The rug merchants, which you see on the screen, the rug merchant bazaar, dating from to Cairo, according to Roberta Mayer, is an example of the sights that enchanted him. Cairo, the de Forest took a trip up the Nile, which Church never did, in a rented double-masted houseboat called a felucca, which you see in a later painting on the left, which I chose so that you could better see, although that's a little bit of an exaggeration, the ship in detail. By the way, I was pleased to know as a sailor that de Forest, the de Forest family sailed actively from Long Island and up the coast. So de Forest, who talks about this trip, knows what he is talking about when he said that it was fun sailing up the Nile because he was sailing against the current, but very boring floating down the other way. You see the narrow Nile River Valley, which was available for him to see on a raised deck of the felucca, provided the subject matter of many of his paintings or studies down the Nile. Their boat, by the way, was a deluxe model, 90 feet long, with a crew of 17 men for their party of 5 or 6. It had, as I said, this raised deck, which gave him a view of the flat plain and the hills beyond. He liked the landscape, he said, better than anything he'd ever seen. In 1 month's time, he made some 61 oil sketches. And the one on the left, the oil sketch on the left, and I don't know its present location, was preparatory for the painting from Gerald Wunderlich, now on view at Deborah Force's gallery, on the right. And it's very interesting to compare the changes that he made from the oil sketch to the larger painting. So he made some 60 sketches before they arrived at the next big stop, the famous temples, complexes of Luxor and Karnak, which you see in 2 paintings here. The one on the left is a small oil sketch, and by the way, his oil sketches were about 9 by 14, or sometimes he cut them in half, so they were half the size. The Ramesseum at Thebes is a large exhibition painting, which we'll hear about in de Forest's own words. He wrote about Karnak, "I think I could find work in the great temple for weeks, even months. Perhaps viewing the temple recalled his earliest painting experiences at the Parthenon with Church, who was inspired by the structure, which he termed the greatest human achievement." De Forest was equipped to draw after the architecture because his friend, Palmer, suggested that he pick up a camera obscura, which he did in Paris at the shop of Charles Chevalier. And this is an example of one of these camera obscuras on the left, and also a smaller version which could open. And he used that, it was very portable, and he used that to sketch from the boat or on land. And here you see a diagram of a young man tracing over the image that the camera obscura takes in through the lens. He wrote, "I found my camera a great use in all of the architectural sketching, as I could draw the most difficult perspective drawings in a few minutes, which would have taken days otherwise." From his sketch, this way we'll go back, from his sketches of both temple complexes, he executed a major exhibition painting on the right, 37 by 30 inches, of the Ramesseum at Karnak, presently on view at the Deborah Force Gallery. He wrote on February 16, 1876, "As for the Great Hall, I should have liked to have made sketches from every part of it, but had to content myself with 8, one of which will certainly make a great large picture." Perhaps this painting of the Ramesseum was the one that resulted. The next stop of the de Forest family tour was Palestine, where they spent a week in Jerusalem. Surprisingly, de Forest did not find anything that interested him in Jerusalem, except for the Mosque of Omar, which he said with some frustration he could not draw. The only view where he could find color was looking off to the Dead Sea. He must have been talking about the view from the Mount of Olives, which you see on the left, which he painted thinking of Church's large painting of the Mount of the temple, from the Temple Mount, from the Mount of Olives, for which I show you a preparatory sketch in the Cooper Hewitt collection. It's the same view, only de Forest is higher up on the hill. At least that's what I conjecture. While the de Forests were in Jerusalem, they took a trip to the Jordan. And this particular oil sketch has entered the Cooper Hewitt collection through the generosity of Solomon Goss Gallery. He wrote about the visit to the Jordan in a letter dated March 20th, 1876. "Today we went to the Jordan, where we bathed again. The river itself is a small brook, very muddy. We got back, presumably, to their camp at 2, and I took my box and walked about 2 miles to make a sketch, which, I would say, came out rather well." And this really is a great sketch. When I was given my choice of de Forest to take in as a gift, I was drawn to this one because it looks very much like Church, but the brushstroke is very particular to de Forest, much looser. Next, the de Forest traveled to Damascus and from there to Palmyra. He writes about painting like this: "As far as I can make out, the entire city was one vast succession of temples, and everywhere there are columns. We counted 350 in perfect condition. They are all Corinthian and mostly in groups from 2 to 20. They are all marble with a rich reddish brown toward the tops and on the southwest side. If you can imagine columns running off in perspective in all sorts of directions, you have some dim idea of Palmyra." Overlapping the years 1877 to 1879, de Forest was busy with his decorating activities, but he was also exhibiting at the same time at the National Academy of Design and the Century Club, among other venues. De Forest's marriage to a DuPont heiress and their honeymoon trip to India marked a decisive phase in Lockwood's professional interior design career. He was in India buying objects for his decorating partnership with Louis Comfort Tiffany. But de Forest continued nonstop to paint whenever he had an occasion and whenever the sights stirred his emotions. I show you, while he was in, after they were in Bombay, they went north to on the way and stopped in Ahmedabad, which was then a banking center and textile center. As we will hear later, Lockwood met Munganbai Huja Singh, a Jain merchant banker with whom he established a workshop for carving teak wood, cutting brass, and copper for interior decoration projects. While in Ahmedabad, de Forest made some sketches. These are typical, but on the left is a rather important sketch because it's a view of the buildings around the workshop that de Forest created. The image on the right, the sketch on the right, we think is Ahmedabad, perhaps the city or the town. From Ahmedabad, de Forest traveled north. And both de Forest traveled north to Jaipur, Agra, Delhi, and Lahore. Southwest of Agra, they stopped at a 16th century fortified city of Fatehpur Sikri, City of Victory, today a World Heritage Site, where de Forest was especially impressed by the red sandstone architecture. And I show you this image on the left, another gift from Sullivan Goss Gallery, and interesting story about that because when I was looking at all the images with Frank Goss, he said, I have one last one to show you. And I said, that's the one I want. He said, I spent several days at Fatehpur Sikri looking at the buildings, and we wish we could have had Birbal's Palace in India, if only I had written ahead. But I did get a chance to look in and sketch some of the interior. But I made a sketch of the exterior, which shone brightly in the sun. This is, as he said, a perfect example of the architecture of Akbar. Another sketch documents de Forest's 150-mile trek through Kashmir and Nepal. In Kashmir, they started staying at rest houses, but because of the fleas, they decided to pitch a tent in between. And this relatively large oil sketch shows the tent in the middle with the log cabins, so to speak, on either side, nestled beneath the mountains. By the early 1900s, de Forest devotes himself increasingly to painting. This is after his work on the Carnegie family library, the Teak Room, of which we're so proud. His oil sketch of Cuernavaca, Mexico, at sunset from 1906 recaptures the dramatic sunset picture of his mentor, Frederic Church, like the image of Hudson, New York, which de Forest could have seen lots of sunset paintings, but this one made a good comparison, even though the painting needs conservation. If any of you want to contribute something, it would be much appreciated. At this time, his paintings were held in cities like St. Louis and Indianapolis. I'm getting to the end here. These are my slides of Lockwood de Forest's house in Santa Barbara, which we snuck around because people live in it now, and although they weren't there or they were hiding, they wouldn't open the house for us to see. In 1915, de Forest moves out permanently to Santa Barbara, where he builds this house on Laguna Street. This move marks the latest phase of his painting oeuvre, which was based in the Santa Barbara area, although he traveled elsewhere. And de Forest died in Santa Barbara in 1932. Finally, I show you one of the Santa Barbara paintings, which I discovered only recently at a local gallery. And I think this is truly lovely. It's called Sunburst and dates from 1903, showing the sun setting behind a scruffy foreground. To conclude, I would say that Lockwood de Forest made many conflicting statements about his painting goals. At one point, he said that he wanted to produce an unmediated experience of nature in the raw, so that people would not think of him, but think directly of nature. But here, I think he's repeating the jargon of the early Hudson River School painters. He more frequently mentions in his letters how the landscape, with its colors and light, moved him emotionally. I think this is the legacy of what de Forest left to us today. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I would like to extend my sincere thanks to Sarah Coffin and Gail Davidson for this kind invitation. I really, truly am delighted to be here. So we are here to celebrate the reopening of Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian National Design Museum and the restoration of Andrew Carnegie's family library. The family library, now known as the Teak Room, was created by Lockwood de Forest between 1899 and 1902 as part of Andrew Carnegie's new Fifth Avenue mansion. The room was photographed in 1938. In addition to de Forest's teak wood furnishings and architectural design elements, the room also contains fixtures from Tiffany Studios. In her talk, Sarah will provide more detail on the Teak Room and its restoration. And I would like to put it into a larger context of de Forest's business and some of his other notable patrons. De Forest formed his first business in 1880 with Louis Comfort Tiffany. As you can see from the R.G. Dunn and Company credit report excerpt at the top, the firm was known as Tiffany and de Forest Decorators. At the time, both men were painting and exhibiting their work for about a decade, and both were shifting their attention to artistic decorating. As part of his partnership with Tiffany, de Forest made his first trip to India in 1881-82, and with some luck, he was able to establish a workshop in Ahmedabad with Muggenbhai Hadi Singh as the manager. Through Hadi Singh, de Forest was able to hire the hereditary Hindu craftsman, or mistri, to produce hand-carved teak wood, everything from simple boards, squares, and brackets to extremely complex interior and exterior architectural elements. In 1881, as the workshop was being developed, de Forest sent hundreds of carved teakwood squares in many different patterns to Tiffany in New York. Tiffany, in turn, used these in many of his early decorating projects. And here in the drawing room of former U.S. Senator and Secretary of State Hamilton Fish, we see Tiffany using these teakwood squares in the design of an overmantel. There's lots more illustrated in artistic houses. The firm of Tiffany and de Forest ended shortly after de Forest returned from India, in part because the two partners began to develop their independent interests. Their formal partnership lasted only 2 years. In May of 1883, de Forest began his own business at 9 East 17th Street under his own name. These are two well-known views of de Forest's showrooms, which he published in his 1885 book, Indian Domestic Architecture. These views capture the full range of de Forest's teakwood squares and moldings, brackets, pierce-carved cusped arches, and elaborate chimney pieces. We also see the Western-style parlor furniture that de Forest designed and had crafted in Ahmedabad. In addition, de Forest offered pink sandstone from Agra, and I actually had my brother-in-law bring me a pointer because it's so hard to see this in black and white. If I can get this to... I'm highlighting me, okay. All right, there we go. So there's our sandstone here and here. So there's your pink, all right. And mashrabias from Cairo, which were open-worked wooden panels of interlocking balls and pegs, and I'm going to point those out too. Okay, there you go. Okay. The hand-painted tiles surrounding the hearth came from Damascus. De Forest had started collecting those in his earlier travels before any business ideas emerged. These two views are less well known, and they show the textiles and carpets that de Forest had acquired in Cairo and India. We also see an example of a hanging seat from Ahmedabad and one of the splendid carved traceries copied from the Mosque of Sidi Said, along with a variety of metalwork. And finally, this view captures de Forest's carved teakwood ceiling panels, as well as an interesting chair that was crafted in teakwood and covered with chased brass ornamented with floral designs. De Forest had seen a similar design in Jodhpur from sketches. This chair was made by the Mistry based on his drawings. And as an aside, 2 of these chairs were purchased from de Forest by William Randolph Hearst in 1922 and were recently acquired by the Virginia Museum of Fine Art. With his showrooms in place, de Forest began to offer his Indian decor, first to friends and family, and soon to Gilded Age patrons across the country. As I just noted, the firm of Tiffany and de Forest was dissolved after only 2 years. Nonetheless, Louis Comfort Tiffany continued to be one of de Forest's important patrons, beginning with the new Tiffany family mansion on 72nd Street in New York. Planning began in 1882, and de Forest provided many interior architectural elements in carved teakwood. Here you see a mantel and a door that was installed in the upper hall. The mantel, 14 feet wide with massive brackets, was particularly striking. These spectacular doors, which were installed in Tiffany's studio, were exhibited at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in conjunction with the 2006 Laurelton Hall exhibition, and are now in the collection of the Charles Hosmer Morse Museum of American Art in Winter Park, Florida. These were clearly based on a design that de Forest found in Multan, today Pakistan, which he published in Indian Domestic Architecture. In addition, large portions of a house that de Forest had salvaged in Ahmedabad were incorporated into Tiffany's studio, as were many of the old Damascus tiles and chests that de Forest had collected. In this room, Tiffany also hung Indian brass chains from the ceiling, using these to suspend mosque lamps, and later, after 1893, his own blown glass globes. Although Tiffany and de Forest operated independently after 1882, they continued to have professional connections throughout their careers. Tiffany was always interested in de Forest's aesthetic sensibility. As discussed by Gail, the Hudson River School painter, Frederic Church, was a de Forest relative and an early important mentor with respect to painting and architectural design. Church was also among de Forest's earliest patrons. Beginning in 1883 and continuing through 1891, Church purchased a variety of de Forest East Indian architectural woodwork and furniture for the main house at Olana in Hudson, New York. On the upper right, we see a small desk that was custom built from de Forest teak wood for Isabel Church. And on the lower right is an 1884 view of the court hall of the main house of Olana. And there we see one of several Kashmiri chairs that de Forest commissioned while summering in Kashmir in 1881. Let's see if I can get the pointer the right way. That's the, which actually you can see upstairs. Okay. De Forest designed the general form, taking his inspiration from an Indian charpoy or bedstead. He then hired local artisans to embellish the surface with intricate floral patterns that were painted over gold leaf and then lacquered. At least a dozen of these chairs were made on his behalf. On the right, we see the chimney piece in the east parlor of the main house at Olana, along with one of de Forest's Kashmiri chairs in the foreground. The lower left is a view of the elaborate chimney piece in the dining room, which Church had executed in India based on Church's conceptual design, shown here at the upper left. When the studio wing was added to the main house at Olana between 1889 and 1891, de Forest was again involved. He provided architectural design advice, along with a substantial carved teakwood balustrade in the entrance hall to the studio wing. He also designed a chimney piece for the new studio, as well as some additional furniture. Church's house today is a wonderfully intact house museum. Lockwood de Forest's older brother was Robert Weeks de Forest, a prominent New York lawyer, and also second president of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Robert and his wife, Emily, who was John Taylor Johnston's daughter, had an 1832 Greek Revival townhouse located at 7 Washington Square. Interior photos of about 1900 to 1910 reveal a house richly appointed with their personal art collection, together with the furnishings from Lockwood. A carved teakwood hanging seat appears in the library, shown at the upper left. The seat was draped with a tiger skin, so the details are not visible, but the heavy brass chains are similar to those that Tiffany used in his studio. On the bottom, you can see that Lockwood also furnished a lion-headed armchair, a writing table, and a large cabinet. And on the upper right, notice the painted Kashmiri chairs in the parlor. Although the house at Washington Square still stands, the contents were sold at auction in 1936. Mary Garrett. Mary Garrett was perhaps de Forest's most enthusiastic patron. She was a friend of Julia Brasher de Forest, who was Lockwood's, and Louise Wakeman Knox, who became Tiffany's second wife in 1886. She was also the fourth child and only daughter of Rachel Harrison and John Work Garrett. John Work Garrett was president of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad until his death in 1884. That year, Mary Garrett received her inheritance, an amount estimated at $9 million. As early as 1885, de Forest began to work on Garrett's home at 101 West Monument Street in Baltimore. It's good. De Forest's large remodeling project for her came in 1887, while Garrett was away from Baltimore and traveling through. He designed a stenciled paint scheme for her large hall, which was later published in the June 1925 edition of Art and Archaeology, and I thank Hiram Woodward for sharing this reference with me. A letter from De Forest to Garrett indicates that the hall had an upper floor and a dome that held a gaslit chandelier. De Forest had the dome gilded and patterned with dark and light blue paint, like that in the old mosaics. For the sitting room, De Forest selected a shade of blue for the ceiling and designed a blue frieze, which seems to have been overlaid with perforated copper. Below the frieze, De Forest had the walls painted with orange, light yellow, and blue. Some of the walls were embellished with perforated teakwood panels, while the teakwood arches were used in windows and in doorways. This house was destroyed in 1940. But much of the interior architecture was donated to the Baltimore Museum of Art. When Mary Garrett moved from Baltimore to Bryn Mawr College in the fall of 1904, she brought much of her furniture with her, including a carved teakwood parlor suite in De Forest's signature style. These are several of the pieces from that suite, and the large hexagonal table still has a shipping label, though badly oxidized, includes Mary Garrett's name. These were probably from the Baltimore sitting room. And it is quite likely that this hanging seat, together with a pair of chased brass bedsteads with pierced carved panels, were also from the Baltimore house. Obviously, one of the headboards is now on view here at the Cooper Hewitt, and again, they're beautiful. Garrett's dazzling interiors are long gone, and pieces from her collection are scattered. But it is easy to see that she was an important patron and that De Forest gave her his most sumptuous designs. And thanks to Mary Garrett and M. Carey Thomas, De Forest also did a lot of later work at Bryn Mawr College. Everything from stenciled walls to lampposts to the design of the gymnasium with his son-in-law. This large topic is beyond the scope of my talk today, but it is worth noting. Although his friends and family helped get his business started, De Forest soon attracted the attention of other prominent patrons, among them Mr. and Mrs. Potter Palmer. Potter Palmer was a successful Chicago businessman and real estate investor, and by the early 1880s, the Palmers were able to build a lavish family home, a crenellated stone castle on Lakeshore Drive. Begun in 1882 and completed in 1884, De Forest was one of several decorators who had a hand in the interior design. He provided a reception room and a large adjoining drawing room, both richly appointed with carved teakwood. De Forest's accounts list a frieze for P. Palmer on November 30th, 1883, and as seen here, a record of Mrs. Palmer's mantle on March 25th, 1885. In 1925, the towering chimney piece shown here was salvaged from the Palmer Castle. Standing over 12 feet high, the clustered spires of the overmantel recall those atop the outer walls of the Hati Singh Jain temple in Ahmedabad, and in all likelihood, it is the mantle identified in De Forest's account book. The whereabouts of this piece is presently not known, and the Palmer Castle was destroyed in 1950. Emily and Franklin McVeigh also took an interest in De Forest's offerings. McVeigh, a Chicago attorney who would serve as U.S. Secretary of the Treasury from 1909 to 1913, was the owner of Franklin McVeigh and Company, wholesale grocers. The McVeigh house was designed by Henry Hobson Richardson, and according to De Forest, Richardson was one of the few professional architects who took an interest in his Indian woodwork. The construction of their house began in 1886, the year of Richardson's death, and it was completed in 1887. De Forest's teakwood tracery from the Mosque of Sidi Said was used as a screen between the parlor and the staircase in the main hall, as shown here on the right. The McVeigh house was destroyed in 1922, But the Sidi Said tracery survived the wrecking ball and was given as a gift to Beloit College in Wisconsin. A fortune from the Comstock silver lode enabled James Clare Flood to build his Nob Hill mansion in San Francisco. So I've taken you across the country. In 1886, de Forest received a commission for a reception room. An interior photograph shows at least some of de Forest's contribution. In the foreground, on the left, is the distinctive lion's head that embellished many of de Forest's armchairs. Sometimes you don't see that right away. It should be, let's see, like right there. Okay. Other carved pieces that appear in the photograph, a table, a footstool, and the large display cabinet, were also clearly designed by de Forest. Ultimately, the interior of the building was gutted by fire following the earthquake of April 18, 1906. The brownstone shell survived, however, and today this refurbished building is home to the Union Pacific Club. In 1888, de Forest turned his attention to building his own house at 7 East 10th Street in New York City, which survives today as the Bronfman Center for Jewish Life at New York University. The 1893 Columbian Exposition in Chicago sparked a second wave of interest in his Indian rooms, and there were other projects that I don't have time to discuss today. By 1900, however, the demand for his exotic interiors had waned, and even this well-illustrated spread in the House Beautiful did not stimulate the market. By 1903, a year after the Carnegie Commission, the business was quiet enough that de Forest could let it go for long stretches and spend his winters in Santa Barbara, California. For a while, he considered moving his decorating business to the West Coast. However, the San Francisco earthquake of 1906 convinced him otherwise. And that year, he approached Tiffany Studios, inquiring as to whether they would be willing to purchase his business. By 1907, the deal was negotiated, and by 1908, Tiffany Studios received de Forest's inventory of carved teak. Tiffany did not continue to cultivate the ties to the Hadi Singh family in Ahmedabad, but he did use de Forest's materials lavishly for at least one, namely Wildwood, a house designed by Bernard Maybeck and built for real estate developer Frank Colton and his wife, a second wife, Frank Colton Havens and his second wife, Leela Rand Havens, in Piedmont, California. The house appears to have been constructed and decorated between 1908 and 1915, and it still retains the spectacular East Indian drawing room and dining room shown here. Not surprisingly, Tiffany also used de Forest's carved teak at Laurelton Hall, as he had previously in his early interior designs and in his New York City home. Laurelton Hall was Tiffany's vast estate in Oyster Bay, Long Island, hoped would become a museum. And in fact, the facade of Tiffany's art gallery of 1918, which stood on the grounds of Laurelton Hall, was embellished with de Forest's carved teakwood. It resembled a house facade from Ahmedabad that de Forest had successfully sold to the South Kensington Museum in 1881. Tiffany's art gallery is also now gone. Although remarkably, this Ahmedabad house facade was returned from London to Ahmedabad. As you can now see, many of Lockwood de Forest's East Indian rooms are long gone. It is most wonderful to see the Carnegie Family Library so beautifully restored and able to showcase the fine teakwood carving that inspired a career and created a legacy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Roberta and Gail, for such interesting talks. And now I hope to be able to continue up to the level of my colleagues. Needless to say, this has been an incredibly exciting time for all of us. And to see this room come back to life and to be able finally to see it with contents that reflect the spirit of the room. Whatever we do with it, I think we will have learned from various exhibitions there that that Lockwood de Forest belongs in the room and is the room and provides the spirit for what we do there. I also want to thank very much another colleague, Heather Ewing, who wrote this book, Life of a Mansion, which is new with our reopening. And Gail and I did a lot of research for that and provided content. But Heather has put this all together and done some wonderful research that very much informs my talk this evening. So once again, we introduced the house, and the library, as you know, faced out this to this side, the 91st Street side, and so had a north light, which is generally slightly less, somewhat less than the southern side, which I think was appropriate given the nature of the room. It owns its existence and its spirit to three men in particular, with a fourth also, and those are Lockwood de Forest himself, Andrew Carnegie, and Howard Russell Butler. Howard Russell Butler was, like de Forest, a painter, and who had also gotten into the world of decorating. And decorating, as it meant then, was really more a case of supervising contractors and finding people to design and make, rather than actually making decorating decisions of the kind that we might associate with today's decorators. That kind of that profession really didn't start until a little late, just slightly later in the 20th century. But Butler had come to know Carnegie somewhat before the house, but as did de Forest, because his father had been on a ship returning from Europe with Andrew Carnegie and made the introduction. And Butler became the founder of the American Society of Artists, which he founded in 1892, having asked Andrew Carnegie and one of the Vanderbilts and some other key people for funding. Of the founding members, all three were there at the inaugural dinner. Instead of having a stone laying, the New York Times reported that it was much more artistic, that they had picked to do a dinner. And who was put in charge of planning the sort of decor of the dinner but Lockwood de Forest. In turn, Andrew Carnegie and Howard Russell Butler sat at the head table together. So what Butler says in his papers that he was responsible for bringing Carnegie to bringing de Forest on board, and as Andrew Carnegie had turned over the management of the decoration of the inside of the house to Butler. Butler at one point was not that well and turned it over to various people to help him, but it is also clear that de Forest was supposed to be part of the package from the beginning. A fourth person was really also part of this group, who was, as Roberta has referred to, Tiffany, because he did play such a significant role with lighting, and also was part of that same inaugural dinner. In fact, it really was quite a small world. Mary Garrett had in fact come to Andrew Carnegie to see, who was a very good friend of her father's, and he had visited down there, and she'd come to see about getting money to help a women's medical college at Johns Hopkins. which he ultimately declined, but nonetheless, Butler had applied to him for monies for various of his projects. I am unaware that de Forest ever asked him for backing in any way, but there are, as I said, there are a great number of connections. In fact, the founding dinner of the Society of Artists was held in, quote unquote, the music hall, as it was called then, which of course was later renamed Carnegie Hall. So that gives you the picture. Carnegie not only underwrote the society, but he also provided the news place to promote the arts in the form of the hall. Again, we see these pictures, but you now see the other direction as well, showing that de Forest, in fact, furnished this with not only the built-in cabinet that you get to see today, but also a library table desk, an armchair, and several chairs with upholstery dotted around the room. So in addition, you can obviously see the turtleback chandelier, Tiffany turtleback chandelier hanging over the table. And let me tell you, that is, as Gail said, she wants the painting restored. There'd be nothing I would like better than if somebody would come forth with any turtleback chandelier that could really add effect to that room. So it also, you will notice, and one reason we're able, in this case, the only floor that we were able to keep from the original original building in the renovation was the Teak Room floor. And as you can see, certainly during the Carnegie's entire period, it was covered with a carpet, which I am sure came from W&J Sloan, because while de Forest had imported carpets, he had also gotten contracts from Sloan to acquire them in India. But on top of that, the Sloans had known the Carnegies in Scotland, and in fact, Carnegie stayed with them when he first arrived off the boat to begin with. They were one of the few people he would sell land to, and so north on 91st Street there are two Sloan houses, the Burden House and the Hammond House, now Sacred Heart, and the Russian consulate, which were Sloan daughters. So this, I think, all again is part of the same world, and of course I think Sloan's, among many other places, probably used de Forest woodwork. A side note on that is that the successor at the Met of Robert de Forest was also from the family. We move on, the Sloan family. We move on here where we have current pictures showing after renovation and before the installation of the exhibition. And I think that this is a wonderful opportunity to see the core of the both the beautiful cabinet, the woodwork on the bookcases, and the detail of the stenciling, both on the wall down the bottom left and on the ceiling on the top of the photograph on the right, as well as the pattern of the flooring, which of course you would have only seen around the borders. It also shows you the fireplace. However, in some ways it isn't in the spirit as intended in the way it is now with the exhibition in it. One more picture here which starts to show you the detail, where you really get this feeling of intense activity of the patterns. And one of the, as you may have seen in our Making Design exhibition, one of the elements of design that is featured is pattern. And here we see many different patterns all up against each other, and yet functioning in a harmonious way. Another couple of views which give you the benefit of seeing the top of the armchair at the desk, and also yet another Tiffany lamp over on the octagonal table, which is also Lockwood de Forest. As you can see, portraits of Andrew and Louise up above. On the right, this detail, which is really almost a still life, gives you the opportunity to see a couple of further chairs up against, in front of the cabinet behind. So this sort of multitude of patterning is not dissimilar from the environments that de Forest was seeing with the woodwork in India and the stonework. Here I show you an example of not the same Tiffany turtleback chandelier, but you can see through, as this one is lit, the effect of the iridized glass and the warm hues in it, how it would have in fact been all part of the part of the original vision. And you will see yet another Tiffany lamp over on the small octagonal table, undoubtedly from India, but probably not from the Ahmedabad studio that's in the background. So all of this, if you can imagine that the light that is colored coming out when the lamps are lit, playing part of this golden hue that's in the stenciling. I just bring this up partly because separate from de Forest and his friendship with and continued work with Tiffany was the fact that Andrew Carnegie, in one of his few design interests, embraced the stained glass work of Louis Comfort Tiffany. While he was no longer his partner, he continued to interact both for the purchase of items and when called for in decorating schemes in both directions. Before this house was built, Carnegie had sent to a castle he had bought in Scotland, Skibo Castle, back in the town where he could now go back as the major success story, having been a poor boy in town when he left. So he had this castle where he imported vast numbers of Tiffany lamps. And in fact, on the left, you will see the Tiffany dragonfly chandelier in the library at Skibo Castle. And on the right, you see it as Margaret Carnegie Miller, his daughter, gave it to the museum in the 1970s. And it's an interesting and telltale moment that this lamp, it was always electrified. It is not one that was converted to electricity. Again, showing, I think part of what interested Carnegie so much about Tiffany's work was the fact that it was really innovative and very distinctly involved a sort of understanding of the chemistry of how to make this iridized glass, which was a better formula than what had been practiced in Central Europe, where they'd been doing it earlier. But Tiffany improved on the amount of effect that he could create. So Carnegie had this love of Tiffany lamps, and they were in fact to be found in old photographs all over the house, which, as I said, probably had nothing to do with, in the sense that de Forest didn't need to bring Tiffany in on this case. It could be possible that, in fact, de Forest came to Andrew Carnegie's attention through Tiffany, but as we've just seen, that necessary either, since they were all very much active with the American Society of Artists. One view here of the exhibition shows you an important loan from the Cleveland Museum of Art of a clock, which is a very complicated sort of commission. It is by Tiffany and Company. Papa Tiffany coming into the act, as he did so often. And in fact, we have vast amounts of purchases for Tiffany and Co., even in the first trip to India in 1881-82, when he was there for over a year. But this one is a Tiffany and Company clock with a Tiffany and Company mechanism. It is possible that Louis designed the dial, but the mixed metals work is very typical of Tiffany and Company, and the clock dial and the barometer, which are below it, are actually of copper with a silver and an enameled metal and bronze all mixed together. So you've got definitely Tiffany commissioning the clock, but you do have Lockwood de Forest provided panels that are set into this. Interestingly, the back behind where the pendulum should be, and you can just see it in this photograph, but you will see it's missing in the photograph of the installation. And the reason for that was, apart from the fact that the pendulum has mercury in it for the barometer and the difficulty of shipping it, and it needing a separate crate, was the fact that we were really interested in seeing the clock, which is the de Forest part of the story, and in fact behind the pendulum, which you wouldn't normally have seen at all anyway much, is carved wood, but it's carved mahogany, and it has a very definitely exotic feel, but in no way is Indian, and in fact has just sort of flamboyant foliage, and clearly done by another hand. Other people who became involved in the building, as we have found, as mainly Heather has found, but both of us have found these references, that was the firm of D.H. Hess. And this could explain why we have been having such a difficult time in documenting some of the work in the house, because Hess, as you can see from this New York Times article of, I believe it's 1907, had a huge fire in their Fifth Avenue store. You will see also that they were called decorators and manufacturers of artistic furniture. Clearly, De Forest provided all the woodwork, but it is very possible that assembling the built-in cabinet and possibly even the tables, the chairs would have been likely to have been sent, and had De Forest having somebody to produce those before they came in. But the built-in cabinet and the bookcases may well have been assembled by Hess. The one document that we have that we know they did was that they were responsible for producing the grand staircase and around the grand staircase. But as I said, the loss of documentation goes a long way. The other firm that was also a candidate for actually doing the assembling in the room is possibly the firm of Port, who worked with Henry Hobson Richardson and others with whom De Forest worked during this period to produce interior woodwork and built-in furniture to other architects or designers' designs. In addition, we have the fact that the one thing that we, as I said, the one reference we have is Butler's reference, in where he says, in an illustration of the way in which I was able to save Carnegie money, I would mention the woodwork of the hall and the grand staircase. 6 firms competed, their estimates ranging from 47 to 125,000. The contract went to Hess and Company, whom I had recommended and who gave the lowest bid. So actually, it's one of the most lavish parts of the house, but it in fact came in at apparently a lower bid than a lot of the other traditional people there. So this did, Carnegie clearly was keeping tabs on the budget, and this would have spoken to him definitely. But it's also true that the firm was associated with quote-unquote artistic work, in other words, not simply contractors, but working with specialist designers. In the course of the researching De Forest for the exhibition, it became clear he viewed his role in bringing Indian design to America as much one of collecting as of creating. And the Kashmiri chair, while officially had made to his order, is in fact typical of some other pieces of European-oriented furniture that were being produced. And of course, when he went up to Lahore and visited John Lockwood Kipling, the father of Rudyard, he was then the head of an art school there, but also had crafts being made. So the likelihood is that that certainly De Forest, in picking out objects to both, this essentially was collecting Kashmiri design in a way that he was putting it into a form that he thought would be useful in the West. Other examples are in the middle of that cabinet is a beadry ware ewer on loan from the Metropolitan Museum. It's an 18th century ewer, and again, one that was probably part of a shipment that he made from one of his trips that then was acquired by the museum. Since his brother was president, he felt very anxious about the brother did, Robert, about not having too many acquisitions directly from Lockwood, so frequently gave pieces. Next in the line, I just want to draw to your attention, if you go into one of the rooms that the Hewitt sisters is in, it was actually Andrew Carnegie's bedroom, and here are some details of the Indian teak decoration in that room. never was a photograph taken of this during the Carnegie's lifetime, so we don't see how it was whether there was anything else in there in terms of the furnishings. But I can say that this Andrew Carnegie would not have allowed this to be in his bedroom if he hadn't been. Yeah, lastly, we have, not lastly, but just at the same time is the 1903 Delhi exhibition publication showing again the various things from the De Forest workshop at the Hudson workshop in Ahmedabad. I'm going to quickly skip through these since we seem to have gotten behind time. And to show you again, here we have a panel in stone from the tomb of Mehboob Begada Sarkesh Rosa in Ahmedabad of the mid-16th century compared with the panels in woodwork. So again, the medium sometimes changed. But I also want to make another point. This cabinet shows that the basic court cupboard form, which was traditionally English and American of the 17th century, is the inspiration for the form of this. It's the ornamentation and the organization that turn it into Indian, the Indian elements. Likewise, this is just to show you briefly a key part of this story. Here is a panel that is of one of the Lockwood de Forest panels that he took a whole set with him, or two sets with him, for his shop and his business, and then had the studio retain one. So as you can see on the bottom right, there's a number 4 on the back of this panel. That enabled him to order up 150 linear feet of pattern number 4 for any given contract. While he did add some paneling in the 1890s trip, almost all, that was the last of any changes. Another example is discussing the thickness of the wood, and interestingly, after Tiffany takes over the studio, he goes and tries to get even thinner panels made, and the Huddisings tell him that they're not going to take responsibility for them breaking in transit. Other combinations, this is difficult to do, it's our time, but the window of the brass foils, you see a wonderful combination of Western window with the use of these foils. And the foils that he had, I just want to quickly go through. Here is an example that is a recent acquisition and a gift, again, of Sullivan Goss, shows you that he used these foils in a variety of shapes and so forth, but he would pick up the motif. It was about motifs and using them in various media. I will not cover this again except to show you the panel on loan from the Indianapolis Museum, which is the red sandstone panel, one of the ones of the type you saw in the photograph that Roberta showed. And you can see a screen, a Jolly screen, actually from Fatehpur Sikri, a photograph that I took when there, directly above it, showing the inspiration. I gather from Amy Poster, who's here, and Kristen Krause, who's here, that these came in, the Indianapolis Museum had understood them to be 16th century when they originally came in, but of course these were among the panels that De Forest commissioned. And here, in fact, is the account for the shipment of 27 cases of Agra stonework, along with silver that says it was specifically for Tiffany already early. And then lastly, I just wanted to show you some jewelry. One of the major stories that really hasn't been discussed enough is how much jewelry De Forest both collected and, in fact, had made at his command. The Huddisings were not only woodworkers and stoneworkers, their carvers obviously worked in multiple media. The little niche upstairs that shows Mita De Forest carved in ivory along with the carved wood around the outside shows that they had many skills. But the metal workers also were able to work in jewelry, but the extraordinary thing about this collection for the Field Museum, it was all bought. We have lengthy accounts from De Forest of his work, of his buying these things as he traveled around India in 1892 on an extended trip, and the principal aim was to buy a great number of pieces. In fact, he provided 250 to Tiffany, who bought them, and then it showed them at the World's Columbian Exhibition in Chicago in 1893. The residue, which was a great number that was not sold there, went to the Field Museum, complete with, when I saw them, with a number of tags saying that they were from Gujarat or Kashmir or wherever, which is a great help in terms of identifying the styles and locations of the jewelry. There she is with the carved ivory. And I just wanted to show the silver cake saw that we acquired a few years ago, because what do you see on it? It's a typical sort of 1860 to 70-ish sort of cake saw, but what's different about it is the engraving on the blade that shows tents, palm trees, and mountains. And I have to hypothesize that that may be from a sketch by Lockwood de Forest, and it's engraved Mita on the handle and descended in the family. So I think that she's being sort of given a present with great congratulations from her husband for bearing with the tents, the fleas, the mice, and other things that went along with it. Another, as it's better views of the Bidri and the silver filigree box, also from the Mets. And then lastly, just to show you that on the right we have a detail of the stenciling. The stenciling is on canvas. And on the walls. The stenciling on the ceiling, which is more like a textile pattern, is on a panel of wood. So they had very different conservation challenges. But you will see on the cover of his book, Illustrations of Design, published 10 years after the wall, it's essentially the same idea, using motifs, but in the case of the book, it was an instructional book on how you may take these motifs and use them in all aspects of design. And so that is so much what we are looking at in making design at Cooper Hewitt, and what we are looking at design history about is how many motifs and how many similarities talk to each other across the ages. Thank you.
Hi, so I know you all have many, many questions. We can only take a couple of questions so that you can get your coats from the coat check. I know I have a ton, but I'm going to let the audience have a chance to ask a few things. Yes, over here, please.
Yes, I'd like to know if there are still craftsmen in Ahmedabad and Gujarat doing the things that were done in that period of time that you discussed.
I don't think there are very many, but the owner of the studio is still a member of the Hudson family, and he is primarily a textile designer, as are so many of his family in that business. But he did tell me that had started up a woodworking studio. So, the owner of the studio now, a member of the Hudson family, Umang Hudson, told me when I was there that he was starting up and has now had some work done by craftsmen whom he's developing. And he said that it's not been as continuous a line as it has been with the textiles and some of the metal work where they've had continuous activity.
Yes, are there any pictures of the work that Lockwood de Forest did in Charles T. Yerke's house?
The Yerke's Commission, I think it is pronounced. The short answer is I was not able to find any, but we know about that commission. It was described.
Do we know what happened to the table in the middle of the library?
I wish we did. Again, it rather surprisingly, or perhaps not so, when Mrs. Carnegie died in 1941 or 2, the contents were dispersed among relatives. They had only one daughter, Margaret Carnegie Miller, who lived in the townhouse that's now the museum offices. But they had a number of cousins and this other relatives, and of course she had several children. So, but what happened exactly is unclear to those tables, because there were some items sold, and those are not in the sale lists. So it's possible they were left there. It's possible that staff were given them or told that they could take them out. No one knows that we've been able to determine.
It's curious to know how Lockwood de Forest in New York City in 1899 would communicate with the Hate Singh family in Ahmedabad. And, you know, the building's being built, and the measurement from the east wall to the west wall is 19 feet 6 inches. So Hate Singh says, Hate Singh receives the drawings. Lockwood de Forest says, listen, there's a slight change. It's not 19 feet 6 inches, it's 18 feet. So what does Hate Singh do? Does he cut the neck off, or of the trunk of the elephant, or does he? I wonder how it worked in terms of communicating between two countries, and it's like 1890,
Well-
the ships going by.
Yeah,
Or is there a prototype made of
Sure, but I'm quite sure, based on the amount of extra paneling that survived in his barn/garage, that he ordered more than he need, and of course it was cut on site. And one very clever thing that he did is he virtually never used any figural designs. It's almost all vines and foliage and things like that. So it means that it makes it much, flower heads. It makes it much easier to cut. There's no risk of having to cut a figure in half. But the answer to your question about communication is the Archives of American Art has de Forest's archives. Roberta researched them, thankfully, extensively. I've done some additional work with them, but they involve a great number of letters. It's slightly surprising that there is less about any specific commissions. De Forest does not talk much about most of his commissions, and usually the clients, unless it was Tiffany, are not mentioned to the Hate Singhs.
Can I ask the final question? I'm really curious from Gail. Did Lockwood de Forest create drawings for his decorative pieces? Like, I love seeing his paintings, and I was wondering how that flows into his work as a decorator and perhaps draftsman or not.
The problem, sorry. Drawings for his decorative pieces, they exist a bit in his papers, but I don't, do you know of any that are owned publicly or privately?
You know, this was surprising to me.
I mean, like, how did, speaking to the gentleman's
Yes.
question, like, how did he communicate his desire to these amazing
had
craftsmen in
yeah.
Ahmedabad?
Yeah.
Or did they wing it?
Well, I do think that we don't have
I think they
all.
were winging it.
Some. I mean, for instance, the Western-style parlor furniture that de Forest designed, it seems like those are basically sketchbook drawings, and we actually do have those. They're at the Archives of American Art with dimensions, and he gives a sort of overall form, this is what I want. But I think he basically trusts his craftsmen to produce, something that is akin to what he wants. And in terms of the specific carvings.
The ornamentation.
Yes,
and the detail.
that's them. And then the only piece that I remember that was like, and again, this has been a few years ago, but when I was spending time at the Archives of American Art, there actually was a full-scale drawing of a chair. So in some instances, he may have, again, communicated with more detailed drawings when there was something, important. I'm sure that the church mantle, for instance, probably came with a little bit more instruction.
Okay, I think Gail has
yeah.
something to add, then I have to close the evening so we can get your coats.
As you were talking, I just remembered that a dealer has a full-scale fragment of a full-scale drawing.
You mean a one-to-one?
Yes.
Wow.
Yes. But it is in pretty poor condition.
We'll take
But
it.
interesting.
Yeah.
He's selling it, unfortunately. I wish he would gift it. It's of a floral pattern, what you can see.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all so much. I know we could talk all night, and thank you guys. You're amazing. What really inspiring work.